Okay, so today, right now, the plan is to have two preeminent scholars and journalists and thinkers who dressed up for you, I know this, talk about managing threats in a post-Bin Laden world. These are issues that I personally have lived and breathed for many years, starting before 9/11. In fact, I was a member of the President's commission, or the Congressional Commission on Terrorism, which wrote a report which we issued in early 2001 predicting a major attack on U.S. soil. It was one of three such reports. And on 9/10/2001, I had lunch with the chairman of that commission, a man named Jerry Bremer, who went on to serve in the Bush administration in Iraq for a year. But at any rate, we were commiserating with each other about the fact that no one was listening. A day later, obviously, the world changed. The Wilson Center has been very active on these issues. It has served as the backdrop for some of the most significant national security policy addresses in recent years. Senator Barack Obama gave a major national security speech here in August of 2007, and John Brennan, who is the top counterterrorism advisor to the president now, gave a major security policy address just 6 weeks ago in April, talking for the first time publicly about drone strikes. The part of Obama's 2007 speech that ultimately gained the most attention was his vow to take out high-value terror targets in Pakistan if then Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf would not. We were reminded of that promise last May when Navy SEALs took out Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan. And we were reminded again last week when a CIA drone strike killed the Al-Qaeda's number 2 Pakistani operative, Abu Yahya al-Libi, in the tribal areas of Pakistan. But an overlooked part of Obama's 2007 remarks was his emphasis on so-called soft power. He asked us to consider the thousands of desperate faces looking up at American military helicopters from conflict zones and refugee camps. Do they feel hope or do they feel hate? He asked the audience. Our country's security, he argued, hangs in the balance. Over the long run, this is something I personally believe, whack-a-mole isn't going to do it. Although much of Al-Qaeda core has been depleted, franchises in other parts of the world are a growing challenge. Affiliates like AQAP in Yemen, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and the hardline Islamist Ansar Deen in Mali base much of their fight on local grievances, but AQAP, for example, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, also encourages attacks on U.S. soil. We'll get into that, I'm sure. Drone strikes can't fix major sources of this strife, and those sources are weak political systems and widespread hunger, at least in Somalia and Mali. So, again, I've said for a decade, our best long-term strategy is to win the argument with the next generation of would-be terrorists who are trying to decide whether to strap on a suicide package or join society. How do we do that? Stay tuned. The U.S. puts its best face forward when it engages in things like humanitarian efforts. Natural disaster relief is one example. At the World Economic Forum in Bangkok just a couple weeks ago, I talked about how our aid after the 2004 tsunami, the Thai floods of 2010, the 2005 earthquake in Pakistan, and the Japanese Fukushima nuclear disaster ultimately helped further regional collaboration on these issues and others, like, say, terrorism. Civilian aid in places like Pakistan is another example. The Wilson Center published a major report on this. Some of our most powerful weapons are poverty reduction and secular education to counter the Islamic schools that inculcate Muslim youth with anti-Western sentiment. In April, the Wilson Center hosted a terrific national security dialogue with the Markle Foundation. The goal of the event was to get digital natives and experienced grandmas like me. These are two camps. I'm not a digital native, and I don't know about these guys, but most of you are definitely not digital natives. You could be grandmas, though, like me, in the same room to debate some of the tough questions, like, do we need a more coherent framework for the collection and use of data? Expectations of privacy are very different among age groups. Think your kids using Facebook. Maybe some of you use it, but I don't. Should the president have a so-called kill switch in the event of a cyber emergency? So now to my buddies over here. Bruce Hoffman, Bruce is this guy, shaved the beard, looked absolutely amazing in his last terror incarnation. Knows quite a bit about these issues, and it is great to have him in the building on a full-time basis for this summer. Bruce, take as long as you want to finish your book. He was certainly one of my go-to people when I was a member of Congress. He headed Rand's office here. I'm sure you have his bio in your package. He's now running the terror program at Georgetown. He's collaborated with Rob Litvak over the years on a series of programs here. But it is obviously much more convenient to have him physically here doing the civil defense drills and knowing that I can sleep more confidently with Bruce Hoffman in my building. Mark Mazzetti, a tenacious reporter for the New York Times, not that I always loved what he wrote, is currently working on a book about war outside of war zones. You saw him in our video. And how the hunt for Al-Qaeda thrust the U.S. into secret wars far from the declared battlegrounds of Iraq and Afghanistan. Mark, again, is here. Let me get the ball rolling. We're not doing speeches, by asking a few questions, and then hopefully you will get to ask questions. Okay, so folks, in this post-Osama bin Laden world, which country do you think poses the biggest threat to our national security? Bruce?
Well, it's an easy answer, but before I give you the easy answer, let me just thank you again for having me back to the Wilson Center. This is my second time in residence, and
it takes some people twice to get it right.
Well, I'm the envy of most of my colleagues that I get to come back a second time, indeed, but there really is no place in the world like the Wilson Center, honestly. It's just an incredible citadel of research and scholarship, and I feel extremely fortunate to have been able to come back a second time. But the easy answer is Pakistan. And it, I think, remains the most problematical country because as successful as we've been in uprooting Al-Qaeda, in diminishing its senior-most ranks, there still is a core of Al-Qaeda operatives and senior commanders there that stubbornly have demonstrated, I think, a remarkable ability to continue to replenish their ranks and even replace the succession of number threes and number twos that we've been so successful the past 3 years in killing off. And there has to be, I think, some level of, if not official complicity, but some means that has enabled Al-Qaeda to survive. And I think the history of terrorism, and indeed of the 30-plus years I've applied to studying, is that as long as terrorists have a sanctuary or a safe haven, whether it's official or unofficial, tolerated or untolerated, but as long as they have that sanctuary and safe haven, final victory will remain elusive.
You agree, Mark?
I do agree with Bruce. I think that you hear a lot about Yemen these days, particularly because the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, is, and Bruce would probably agree, considered the most powerful, perhaps dangerous group right now in perhaps the world, perhaps even more dangerous right now to United States interests than the core in Pakistan. And if there is going to be an attack, another 9/11 style attack, or even something on a far lower scale, it probably, or the CIA believes it would likely come out of Yemen. However, Pakistan is just orders of magnitude a more important country. The dynamics are so much more complicated. Pakistan has a nuclear arsenal. Yemen does not. The dynamics in the middle of the Afghanistan, India, China, Pakistan region are so much more critical. And I think right now where we're seeing this intense relationship between the United States and Pakistan that we've had since 9/11, fray, and more than fray, I think the two sides are starting to go to different corners, realizing that this sort of tight embrace we've been in for the last decade isn't making anyone happy, and in fact we're just angering each other. So as Pakistan, I think, moves away from the United States, I think that the potential for chaos there could intensify. So I would agree with that. And before I just finish this answer, I wanted to echo what Bruce was saying about being at the Wilson Center. It's I've been here since the fall. It's been one of the greatest professional experiences I've ever had, and just a tremendous place to work and to think. And if you saw my cubicle at the New York Times and then walked down the hall and saw the office I have, you can understand why I don't want to go back, actually.
Thank you. Let me just push you a bit on Yemen. There's an online piece by CNN this morning saying that Al-Qaeda's Yemeni affiliate has posted several messages on jihadist forums in a recruitment campaign directed at supporters already living in the West. This is to get these so-called lone wolves. These are mostly disaffected people living in the U.S. They're not all citizens or even legal residents here, but they're here to engage in what are called martyrdom operations. And here's one of the things it says, I'm sure in colloquial English. Corresponding with those who yearn for martyrdom operations and the brothers who are searching to execute an operation that would cause great damage to the enemies, the goal now is to activate those brothers who reside in the land of the enemy, whether Jewish, Christian, or apostates, as clearly individual jihad, or the so-called lone wolf, has become popular. And this is online. There is a magazine that many of us have read over the years called Inspire, which has now come out with its 9th edition, which includes details on how to do martyrdom operations. So my question is, how serious is this threat, and what are the ways that we most effectively can counter it? Do you buy into my notion that we can't just play whack-a-mole? We really have to put a counter-argument out there that is more persuasive to people than just this B-roll that they see constantly showing the impact of U.S. drone operations, or in some other ways selected parts of U.S. campaigns in foreign war theater.
I mean, if the first answer to your question is it's a very real problem. It's a very real threat. I think that, Yemen is this interesting case study where the U.S. has been at war, in essence, for a decade. It's just been a war that's not been in the news very much, and it's been largely in secret. With the blessing of the former dictator in Yemen, Abdullah Ali Saleh, the United States was allowed to operate. Now Saleh is gone. There has been the Arab Spring there, and it is a lot more. The extent that the U.S. will be able to operate in the future is very much in question. That being said, even with the U.S. operating, as Jane points out, what are the tactics? Right now in Yemen, the United States is carrying out 2 parallel drone operations. The CIA is doing drone strikes. The U.S. military is doing drone strikes. The drone strikes have escalated significantly just in the last few months. And you can see, to some degree, the number of strikes going down in Pakistan, or at least the rate is going down compared to where it's been the last few years, and going up in Yemen. So I think the Bush administration and the Obama administration has very much embraced and fallen in love with this new tactic of remote-controlled war. And it has been very successful in taking out senior leaders. At the same time, there is, may always be a number 3, a number 4, a number 5 operative to fill the ranks. And what goes beyond the drone strikes? And right now, I think if you just look at Yemen, the situation there does not appear to be getting better, quote, from a U.S. perspective, even amidst the drone strikes. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is carving out more territory. The population doesn't seem to be turning more towards, the United States view of the world, and there is the potential that these strikes could only radicalize those who are kind of on the fence.
You agree, Bruce?
Yes, I do. And I think the challenge that this administration faces, and whoever's in the White House next year is going to face, I think, in the next phase in the war on terrorism, is encapsulated by encapsulated by Yemen. And it's really this hybridization of the threat. It used to be, back in the 90s, Al-Qaeda primarily was all about the near enemy, about as they defined it, the repressive authoritarian regimes that were anti-Islamic. They then shifted dramatically on September 11th, 2001 to the far enemy. And what we see in Yemen today is really a combination of both those approaches, what you might call global. And this has been, I think, one of Al-Qaeda Central's main successes, is transforming local problems into global ones and making global programs, or placing global problems even within the remit of local groups. And that's why you have the situation where a group that is struggling, as Mark described, to wrest control of territory, to exercise sovereignty over a population in Yemen, is simultaneously, as we know from events of the past month, still plotting and planning attacks against the United States or against U.S. interests. So that, I think, is going to be a big change in the Al-Qaeda strategy that we'll have to contend with. I think what we see, though, isn't terribly new. In 2001, in fact, in December 2001, in Knights Under the Prophet's Banner, which was Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, is now sort of clarion call to battle after Al-Qaeda was being soundly thrashed in Afghanistan. He advocated almost the words that you said from this latest propaganda ploy from Yemen, is exactly the words that he was issuing 10 years ago, and the local groups are now catching up and emulating the center. And I think you're absolutely right. Historically, decapitation strategies have been very successful tactically in knocking groups back on their heels, but not over the long term undermining their resilience.
So, what about my thought about a counter-narrative and about civilian aid and about, more and more coordinated disaster relief and other things we could do with soft power as a way, and by the way, living our values, making sure that the rule of law applies to people we apprehend in the battlefield. I mean, what do you think are the strengths of that approach? Not to the exclusion of drone strikes. I personally support a drone program, but it has to be, as John Brennan said here, within strict legal boundaries and understood by the American people. Its purposes have to be understood, and we have to execute it extremely carefully. So what do you think about that?
No, I agree completely. I think you have to break the backs of the terrorist groups, obviously, and you have to diminish their leadership and the people coming into their ranks. But I think equally important, disaster relief aid starts to recalibrate the environment. We've seen practically in the early part of the last decade, when after the massive earthquakes in Pakistan, how with U.S. support and intervention, support of the United States increased. We saw this in Aceh in Indonesia as well. I think, though, the biggest issue and the most immediate leverage we could get using soft power is capitalizing on this issue, which Al-Qaeda themselves, that bin Laden himself, knew was their Achilles heel, and that's the killing of Muslims, that they've killed far more Muslims than they have their stated enemies. And I don't think we do enough to capitalize on that.
And I think things started to turn with that bombing of a wedding party in Amman, Jordan, by, I guess it was Al-Qaeda from Iraq.
It was Zarqawi in November 2005.
All of a sudden, yes, that created a huge backlash. So, Mark, what about leaks? In case you noticed, a lot of people, including me, have been enormously concerned that some of the more recent leaks really expose our capability, ongoing capability against future targets, and are very unhappy. And on a bipartisan basis, Congress has been pushing for legislation and action. The Attorney General just appointed 2 in-house U.S. attorneys to investigate. I know you're part of the Fourth Estate, and I surely support a free press. However, been through these arguments over the years. I mean, what is your personal? You're at Wilson now. You're not representing your newspaper. Mark, what is your personal view of this?
I mean, I've been covering national security since just a few months before 9/11, and so my experience is in this very intense period where those who cover this are dealing with classified information almost entirely, and the things you report on are the things that the government some ways tries to keep the most secret, and you have to be very judicious about how you report things and in a responsible manner. I mean, at the New York Times, we're always our default position is to publish as much as possible, the more disclosure as possible. But that never means entirely full disclosure. I think the problem is that there's always concerns about leaks, and this is not just in this period. It's through not only American history. The press reports on things. If they're doing their job, they're reporting on things that the government doesn't want them to report on. And so there will always then be efforts by the government to clamp down. I think that what we're finding now is, it's a very interesting dynamic where you have a program. Let's just take the drone program, okay? It is a classified program. The drone strikes are remain classified. Now, John Brennan came here 6 weeks ago, and he did say, acknowledge for the first time, yes, we use drones, but try calling the White House after each drone strike and asking for information. Their position is that John Brennan's speech didn't change anything in terms of us reporting on what happens. It's just to get out there and say, we use these things. But as a reporter, you're so it's the biggest open secret in Washington and the world, and yet it's classified. And so the question is, what good is it as a classified program, and what good is it for the United States to not talk about it? What it's doing. Besides the sources and methods issue, I know a lot of people in the U.S. government who say, the best thing we could do would be to acknowledge this program and talk about why we're doing this in Pakistan and Yemen and all that. Instead, it's this. It is all still behind this very thin veil of secrecy, and so therefore the U.S. can't come out and defend why it's doing these things.
But isn't that what Brennan did? He said he wasn't going to talk about individual operations, and I would argue that he was right about that. Because how we target, who we target, is something I don't think we should be sharing with the general public, especially those who might live in Pakistan and harbor these people. But he talked about the general program and its contours and how the White House believes it complies fully with law and the Constitution.
And that's fine, and that is fine. But I think the problem, and when I said that there's concern in the government, is after any drone strike in Pakistan, there is a counter-narrative that comes out and said 45 civilians were killed. And I know people who know for a fact that certain elements of the Pakistani government are fostering that campaign. The U.S. cannot say, well, no, in fact, 45 civilians weren't killed. This is what happened, because it's a classified program. And so in ways, there are ways where it hamstrings the effort you're talking about, which is the American message. What the U.S. is doing, which is what they're saying is surgical and very carefully considered. But the way it comes out in the press is U.S. drone strikes kills 45 civilians, fomenting more anti-Americanism in Pakistan. So that's I think the downside.
Which is why it can't be our only tool, and I think everybody would agree with that. I want to open this to questions, but I want to give each of you an opportunity to describe what you're doing here, little shameless self-promotion for the Wilson Center, and why it's, you could elaborate more than just your office, Mark, why it's so wonderful to be here. Let's start with Bruce.
Well, I'm doing something completely different than what I've been talking to you about, which is I think actually good for someone to sort of replenish their scholarly skills elsewhere. I'm writing a history of terrorism and counterterrorism in pre-state Israel. In other words, the influence that political violence had over British policy in Palestine during the period of British rule of that country, largely from 1917 until 1947.
What I'm doing is as Jane mentioned, looking at the war away from the big wars of the last since 9/11. So you away from Iraq and Afghanistan, where the U.S. has been at war, and it's in places like Pakistan, Yemen, North Africa, East Africa, and how it changed how we do war. So the how it has changed the CIA, driven in very much in the direction of paramilitary activities, manhunting activities, away from the traditional espionage that the agency was doing during the Cold War. How it changed the military, sending the American military into places. If you looked at 9/11, the military went into where we were in war. Through various new legal authorities and new authorizations under the Bush administration and the Obama administration, the military now operates all around the globe in secret. So there's been this sort of convergence of the military and the intelligence world into this kind of new model of war, and that's what I'm exploring.
Okay. Do we have microphones here or microphones? Where are my? Hold them up. There is one mic. There are two microphones. So don't talk until you have a microphone in front of your face, and please identify yourselves. Stuart Bernstein. Wait, don't talk.
Thank you. Jane, I'm all for soft power, but how can we sit back and allow safe havens? I don't care who it is. We didn't in Afghanistan.
Okay, folks. Safe havens where? You're thinking Syria?
Pakistan or Yemen or wherever
I just mentioned, I don't think we're allowing those. I think the drone policy, among other things, is targeting what was a safe haven, which was the tribal areas of Pakistan, and the comments by this administration, I've just happened to notice, against the Haqqani network in particular, are pretty clear. But let's see what the others say. And I'm not for tolerating that, by the way, personally. I'm for a mix of tools.
Yeah, soft power, great, right. But why are we not doing more?
Mark or Bruce?
Well, I would ask, in your mind, what more should be done? I mean, the interesting dynamic, if you just take a place like Yemen, right?
Remember what President Bush said? Mm-hmm. If you harbor, you're our foe.
Right. So then the question is does that mean invading Pakistan, invading Yemen? These are all. Certainly this has been discussed in the last 10 years. They bring up the very points. The summer of 2008, the Al-Qaeda safe haven in Pakistan was probably at its most secure, and there was this debate inside the Bush administration about, what do we do? And the question was, should we invade the tribal areas of Pakistan with American ground troops? And given everything that was happening in Afghanistan at the time, already had happened in Iraq, that was pretty quickly taken off the table. And so therefore, this policy of intensified drone strikes. This is why the drone is the most influential weapon since 9/11, and you could argue it is the sort of changed war the way ICBMs changed war and the tank changed war. This is we're in the drone era now. So the Obama administration has looked at the case of Yemen and they said, okay, do we invade with American troops or do we do drone strikes? These are the policy decisions that are being made now and weighing these very difficult choices. Now, you may look at it and say we should do much more, and there are some that would agree with you. I think, though, the question is, then they'll go to the Pentagon and say, okay, we're going to invade Yemen, and then the generals will say, absolutely not, we're not going to invade Yemen, or Iran. The question is, should we invade Iran to keep them from getting a nuclear weapon? Well, if you liked the Iraq War, you'd love the Iran War.
Bruce, do you have anything to add on it?
Well, I would say I'm hoping that one of the silver linings of our early withdrawal from Afghanistan will mean that we can apply a lot more pressure to Pakistan. Because, of course, a lot of the delicacy of, I think, our current position on Pakistan is to reopen the supply routes in reverse down to Karachi from the Khyber Pass so that we can get out our men and material fairly safely. Once we have a reduced presence in Afghanistan, I think that should give us a lot more leverage with Pakistan. And I think it has to start there because I think that the continual diminution of Al-Qaeda core in Pakistan will radiate outwards and affect the affiliates and associates. I agree completely is that we can't rely completely on soft power, but I think we have to be smarter in how we use hard power. And I think it's a back to the future type of situation where exactly as President Kennedy, when he envisioned the Special Forces, the Green Berets, it wasn't exclusively kicking down doors and killing terrorists or guerrillas in that era, which was certainly part of their mission, but it was also acting as a force multiplier. I mean, the preeminent mission of the Green Berets is what's called unconventional warfare, which is training indigenous forces in counter-guerrilla operations, in counterterrorism. And I think that's going to be the challenge for the next administration, is building up special forces even beyond their existence now to enable us to protect power, let's say in a softer manner, but still from a military basis.
Wendy? Did I see Wendy?
Hi, Wendy Lewis. It has been said that cyber warfare in Iran, in the centrifuges, the Stuxnets and all the others, set back their nuclear program approximately 18 months to 2 years, which is about what a military strike was estimated to have done. Should we be emphasizing far more on the cyber warfare and other means like that, rather than, as you say, just wait till you have an Iran war? And how do we influence public opinion and the Israelis on that one?
Influence the Israelis in terms of not doing a military strike. The estimates of how far anything is always set back are always really they're just that, they're estimates, and I think it is hard to know. I think that the indications do seem to be that the cyber campaign aimed at the Iranian program did set it back significantly. The question then, though, is that once they recover, you can only do this so many times, and would a military strike set it back even more, or just buy another year? I mean, I think that the Israeli view has been, well, even if it sets it back a year, that's a year before they get a bomb, and so that's potentially worthwhile. And certainly, the United States and the American military are very, very concerned about an Israeli strike because I did a story 3 or 4 months ago for the paper about a war game that was conducted at Central Command, and the war game was, if there is an Israeli strike, kind of what happens. And war games are what they are. They're one scenario, but the way that CENTCOM sort of gamed it out was this quickly escalates into a regional war, and the United States is brought into it because Iran doesn't really distinguish an Israeli attack from a U.S. attack. If the Israelis attack, even if they were able to attack entirely on their own without U.S. support, it would be interpreted that there would be U.S. complicity and that the American forces in the Gulf could be hit, ships in the Persian Gulf. So it is I think, in your question about how can the Israeli government be influenced, I mean, I think to some degree, over the last 3 or 4 years, at times, it seems like the temperature has been rising, and then it's cooled off, in part because there's been this effort by the United States, specifically the Obama administration, to get them, not to carry out a strike. I still, though, am a little bit suspicious about just how serious some of those flare-ups were in terms of the Israelis saying they were going to do it. I think that it has served a purpose, in part, to make it seem like the Israelis are prepared to do it, and perhaps to influence Iran. So I could be very wrong, but I've wondered whether part of it is for public consumption.
Where were we? Ginny Edlovich.
Considering today's economic climate and the fact that most of the countries we're talking about are politically hostile to the United States, how do you anticipate providing the resources and aid, and how do you integrate those programs in areas where we have very little influence?
Well, since everyone's looking at me for a second, I think that's the challenge, or a major part of the challenge. Now, I'm all for hard power, but as one of these two said, smart power is better, which is the right mix, which changes, on an hourly basis depending on what you're dealing with. But if we don't show populations in places, like the toughest places, like Pakistan or Egypt, and that's a really tough place. Stay tuned for the presidential runoff this weekend. that we care about them and that we support a transition to a government that cares about them, if any can be arranged. We I think over time will have a harder time of containing the bad stuff in those countries if that's one of our goals, and protecting U.S. Security interests. So I don't know what you two think. Bruce is shaking his head. He doesn't think. But the report we did here on civilian aid to Pakistan got an enormous amount of attention. And again, in Egypt, the immediate instinct of Congress is to whack the aid. Depends what aid. Conditioning the military aid maybe would have been a good idea. That's not the course that the Obama administration chose. That might have been a good idea because that was the target of the conversation. But to have people think that the U.S. isn't interested in them anymore, I think is a big problem. Mark, you have anything?
Yeah,
to add?
I mean, I've been several times to Pakistan. I hope to go again next month. And I mean, you talk to people, even people who are inclined to be pro-American, and Pakistan for years and years really was. People forget that, but they do think that I mean the U.S.'s interest in Pakistan is killing people. And the amount of money that for years and years was held up. I mean, there was billions of dollars approved to do reconstruction, to work in the tribal areas. Just didn't go anywhere. And so. And we had a very hard time within the State Department to get personnel out there, and just it was the money had been approved, but there was just no infrastructure in place, and so therefore, absent the tangible signs of U.S. support and aid in things other than counterterrorism, you get drone strikes, and that dominates the message.
Carlos. Wait. Okay.
Thank you. May I? Okay.
Sure.
How does the political dynamics in Egypt change the equation? If it does at all.
I think very importantly, because the jihadis or the Al-Qaeda types are certainly watching, I think, and poised to take advantage of whatever opportunity they see presents itself. In other words, I think even from their propaganda recently, they predict in Algeria circa 1990s type of response that democracy will not take hold, that democracy will not work, and therefore they condemn. I mean, for them, the best thing would be for the Salafis, for instance, to be frozen out of power, for an election that puts back in power exactly the people that the democracy movement was supposed to remove, and they'll pounce on that opportunity to say, see, you've tried democracy, it doesn't work. Our way is the only way. So I think they're watching events in Egypt just as closely as anyone else. In fact, in the past month, Zawahiri, it hasn't really been reported very much because Zawahiri isn't nearly as telegenic or, I think, as charismatic as bin Laden was. But in the past month, he's issued 6 statements on political developments, in essence, from Tunisia up to Syria and all the countries in between. So he's watching very closely, not least because that is his native land. And I think he's hoping that he'll be presented with an opportunity that will reposition Al-Qaeda more prominently than it has been in the Arab Spring or in the succession, what he hopes will be an Arab winter.
Let me just add something there. Some commentator this weekend called the runoff in Egypt the choice between 2 diseases. I was there for the first round of the presidential election as an official observer, and the technical side of the election went very well. It was stunning to those of us who were paying attention that these 2 people emerged. Unfortunately, or I would say that's my personal opinion, the middle had so many candidates they canceled each other out. So the 2 most candidates representing the 2 extremes are now in the runoff. The Wilson Center has published a primer called The Islamists Are Coming. Robin Wright was the editor, and we updated online. And the message of this book is that there isn't just one form of political Islam. There are 52 organized political groups, and none of them is Al-Qaeda. I would argue that as grim as Egypt looks, it's still better than having the Islamist movement be outside the political arena. Now there are parties running for office, and even if Safik, who is the non-Islamist, the secular candidate in the runoff, who was the last prime minister under Mubarak, and you could argue is just a continuation of the Mubarak regime, even if he wins, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis still control a majority of the parliament. So it's not like they're excluded from the government. I don't know how this will come out, but I think forces have been unleashed driven by a totally repressed population that won't be able to be put back in the bottle. Someone at some other event we had here said one day that the Arab citizen has been born. So I think there are some positives. I may eat my words next week when the whole country is embroiled in flames. But I think these changes are not going to be denied in some form. And I think it is a good thing. I would hope that whichever administration wins our interminable election will continue to agree to support the side of this argument that is for freedom and pluralism and not a return to autocracy. Let me just try this side. Yes. Wait. This is my power over this group.
Roberto Alvarez, what, other than the individual martyrdom that has been pointed out that through Inspire and other means are being promoted, what is the gravest threat that Al-Qaeda affiliates pose now towards the West? What, a dirty nuclear bomb, what is out there?
Well, I would say the greatest threat is their ability or their desire to try to harness or take advantage of instability, especially in nascent democracies, to take advantage of the upheaval in those countries to establish a presence. That, I think, is first and foremost. In more specific terms, I think what's so worrisome about a group like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which Mark had talked about earlier, is demonstrated, I think, in a simple analogy. Al-Qaeda itself, the core group, was created in 1988, and it took them about a decade before they were capable of really acting on an international scene. Of course, they burst into the open with the bombings of the U.S. embassies, simultaneous in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998. AQAP, in essence, was organized in January 2009. By September that year, they nearly succeeded with an extremely clever and extremely innovative as well explosive device in killing the senior Saudi official responsible for counterterrorism. And then, indeed, within a year of their formation, they had presented the United States with the most serious threat since 9/11, which was the Christmas Day bomb. And that, I think, is the real worry, is that this is a group that in a much shorter period of time, it hasn't taken them a decade. It didn't take them a decade. It took them a year, and it's taking them now even a shorter period to constantly innovate and to constantly identify new gaps in our defenses to counter them, which suggests as much and as considerable the success we've had against the Al-Qaeda core leadership has been. We see a local group that 10 years ago probably would have been extremely parochial, would have just been concerned with issues in their own sort of domain. But again, this hybridization, and I think Al-Qaeda core's influence on them has given them not just greater international aspirations, but they also understand that a successful attack against an American target is going to catapult them to basically the lead of this movement. So I would say the biggest threat is, as we've seen it in the past few months, it's from very innovative and clever means that have been directed against commercial aviation, because even despite the vast improvements we've had in commercial aviation security, they're still working to frustrate and to obviate those successes. And, I mean, the latest iteration, about a year ago, I was at a Defense Department, a Defense Intelligence Agency. There was a 60th anniversary conference, and someone put up a slide with the acronym SIIED. I had no idea what that was until the speaker actually got to that bullet point, and he said, "This is what we're now calling a surgically implanted improvised explosive device," which he said, which now we know from TSA circulars, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has been attempting to perfect. In other words, implanting a bomb in someone's body. So, you know, it's in my view, it's the low-level threats that we really have to worry about, because that's where they're working hardest to pierce our defenses.
And add to that, if Pakistan's government fails, it already has, at least according to one writer, Jeff Goldberg, 6 insecure nuclear sites. There is a real danger that nuclear materials get in the wrong hands, the hands of those who've been harbored in Pakistan, and they can cause havoc anywhere. There are also opportunities to make dirty bombs inside this country using radiological materials that are in hospitals, et cetera. So it's an ugly set of possibilities, again, which require us to be very assertive in terms of using our technical tools, which hopefully don't leak to the newspapers before we use them effectively, and our best arguments. Okay, Roger. Don't talk.
I'd like to move the focus geographically for a minute. I was at a conference a couple of months ago where someone described Honduras as becoming the next Somalia, right here on our doorstep, and ask you if you see any indication that global terrorism is beginning to look at instability in Central America, linking up with drug cartels to pose an additional threat to our hemisphere.
And Bruce may be better to talk about this. I've done a little bit of reporting on it, but I wouldn't call myself an expert at all. I know certainly that this has been a concern for years of parts of Latin America that not only are ungoverned, but also might have the drug networks that could link up with terror networks and also become an easy way for some of these people to get into the United States because it's so much closer. For a long time, the Pentagon and CIA have looked at this the tri-border region in South America. There is a lot of Hezbollah money that flows to this region. That has been a concern. And in Honduras, it's a very fascinating idea, and I don't know specifically on Honduras how great the level of concern about that, as you say, becoming the next Somalia.
Well, I think Mark has it exactly right. Over the past at least 20 years, we've seen a large Shia presence influenced by Iran, often involving Lebanese. I mean, there's a very large Lebanese expatriate community in the Triple Border area that Mark described between Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. That was, in fact, pivotal in the 2 attacks that were mounted in Buenos Aires in 1992 and 1994 against the Israeli embassy and the Jewish community center. In Central America, there's actually less of a Shia community. Historically, there's been something of a Sunni community. In fact, in the 1970s and 80s, there were not a huge number, but at least they were prominent. One of the hijackers who worked with Layla Khalid in the Palestine Front for the Liberation of Palestine was, in fact, a Nicaraguan citizen of Arabic descent. But I think the key has been where there's Shia, there's been much more of an infrastructure that groups like Hezbollah could come in and take advantage of on occasion to engage in terrorism, such as the Buenos Aires attacks, but also cigarette smuggling, consumer goods smuggling, weapons and narcotics, and so on. At least from my observation, I'm by no means a Central American or even Latin American expert. Cynthia Arnson here is actually much better on this issue. But they've seemed to be able to gain less traction in Central America. So I think one can say that if the opportunity doesn't present itself in the future for, I would say, more likely Shia groups that are like Hezbollah that are familiar with the terrain would be more likely to get into bed with narcotics traffickers to create an unstable environment like Somalia in Central America than, let's say, a group like Al-Qaeda that would really have very few contacts there and really not have any sort of local knowledge that would enable them to get that toehold.
Yeah. Well, right now, from everything I know, the evidence is minimal that this is this drug money to fuel terror attacks in the U.S. is taking hold, but it could, and certainly drug money fuels terror attacks around the world. The poppy crop in Afghanistan supports some farmers who probably couldn't live without it, but it really supports this middle level that takes all the profits and gives them to bad guys. Let's see. Let's try the other side. Toby, you'll be second. Way in the back. I can't see that far.
Thank you very much. Cyber and drone attacks help keep U.S. troops out of harm's way, but given the projected conflicts that are being talked about today and increased suicides within our American troops, do you foresee a reinstatement to the draft? My name is Mike Marsham with Rockefeller.
Interesting question. I would say I don't. I think that we've seen. The last 10 years, 11 years have put more of a strain on the volunteer military than ever before. I covered the Pentagon for 5 years, and so you would see it in a lot of different ways. And as you cited, the suicide rates are spiking. I think it'll be years, I think, before we sort of see the effect on the military, on veterans, and I think we're just sort of we're just starting to see it now. So it could be very grim. I do not see a return to the draft. I think the quote ending of the Iraq War, or at least the American involvement, the drawdown in Afghanistan is allowing the Pentagon to refit its people, get them out of the sort of constant deployments, and then if they were to be used again, there would be a larger pool. However, I do wonder where if you're looking out at the next 10 years, where you're going to see large numbers of U.S. troops. You pointed to drones and cyber attacks. I think that what we're seeing increasingly is, for a lot of reasons, it's the sort of fatigue of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, the costs, the strains on the budgets. We're seeing much more of the sort of secret war, the secret low-level, low-grade war, trying to be carried out without large manpower. And that has certainly been the Obama administration's model. And I think that if President Obama were to be reelected in November, or if Mitt Romney were to win, I think either one is going to continue to pursue the strategy.
Toby. Very well behaved, Toby.
I wonder if we could turn this back to soft power and talk about how we can effectively implement increases in soft power in view of the congressional resistance to any increased spending, let alone in this area. And does that lead us into considering multilateral efforts in soft power, sort of a coalition of the willing for soft power?
Well, I say, given the economic climate, at least amongst our closest allies in NATO, it's probably less likely, especially if we're not in the lead. I think one of the answers lies working more closely with NGOs and with groups that I think have a standing and a relevance that sometimes governments don't have the ability to prioritize or don't have the credibility. I have to say, it pains me enormously. I just had lunch with a friend of actually Jane and mine, Carrie Lamack, whose mother died on September 11th in American Airlines Flight 11, who went on to found the Families for September 11th and more recently the Global Survivors Network, where she works with victims of terrorism throughout the world, particularly in Pakistan, and where they've had tremendous success. In fact, the film that she co-produced, Killing in the Name, was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Short Documentary. But yet she's run out of money and is going to have to fold her organization. Now, she was getting money from the British government, for example, was getting some money from the Australian government. But again, they're wondering why a U.S.-based organization hasn't been supported by our own government and the funding has dried up. But I think especially at a time of global budgetary drawdowns, it's precisely people like that, and also those who have the credibility, having lost loved ones, who are going to have the greatest impact with soft power. I think overall, looking at the past 10 years, one of the biggest problems about soft power, at least, and I don't want to speak from a congressional perspective because we have someone here who could speak much better and more articulately than I can, but the trouble is there's no metrics. And I think that's one reason why we've become so enamored of the drone campaign, because there are metrics. We saw one last week when we got the number 2 in Al-Qaeda. And that's always been, I think, a challenge. Perhaps if there is a way to redefine expectations, I'm not sure that soft power is amenable to metrics. I mean, how can you ever measure if you've persuaded someone not to become a terrorist or you've persuaded someone not to adopt radical views? But that may be the suspension of belief that we have to accept, to recognize that as someone famously said just a few years ago in the war on terrorism, we can't kill our way to victory, and that these types of endeavors are just as important, even if their tangible benefits don't manifest themselves within the lifespan of a presidential administration or a congressional term.
Well, to remind you all, there was a few years ago, Bob Gates and Hillary Clinton held hands, and he said the State Department should have more money focused against the threats that the Defense Department cares about. The State Department published something called, the Defense Department does the Quadrennial Defense Review, the QDR. State Department did the QDDR, the Quadrennial Development and Diplomacy Review. I think that's right. And there has been an effort to align both budgets. The State Department is teeny, the Defense Department is big, to integrate these topics. How well that's going, I guess we'll have to see. But the comment about metrics is right. Rob Litvak, I know you haven't volunteered, but Rob is the vice president for scholars here, was our vice president for programs, and has just come out with a book called Outlier States. And I think you might describe what you have worked on, because I think it does relate to all this. And a microphone is going to be put in your face even though you weren't expecting this.
Well, thanks, Jane. The book is just out. There'll be a national conversation about this on June 20th. And the book focuses broadly on a Wilsonian question, which is how do you bring states into compliance with international norms? And the term outlier states was introduced by the Obama administration in contrast to the term used by the previous administration, rogue states, to indicate to the outliers, North Korea, Iran, that there is a pathway for them to rejoin the international community if they come into compliance with international norms, that the door is open. The question is, what are the strategies that one can adopt to induce or coerce them to come into compliance? What does one do if what the extended hand that Obama rhetorically offered in his inaugural address is rebuffed? And the overall topic relates to a broader set of states, one of which Jane just visited, Myanmar, Burma, which poses a different type of problem. But the fishing license, so to speak, is the same, which is how do you promote compliance with norms? What's the mix of different instruments that can be brought to bear? So more on that on June 20th. Tom Friedman will be the commentator for those interested.
Did everyone hear that? Tom Friedman, and who else is part of that discussion?
Steve Inskeep, Tom Friedman, and myself on
and Steve Inskeep, if you're listening to NPR, whether it's federally funded or not, it's his tooling around the neighborhood. He's doing a 2,000-mile road trip in North Africa right now, and he was in Tripoli last time I heard him this morning. So it's very interesting. Other questions? I think we can take just a few more. Now, what am I going to do? Okay, let's go there. Yeah.
We have the drawdown going on in Afghanistan. Does that, what do you think the possibility that will become the safe haven again for terrorists as soon as we leave? And secondary, what is the U.S. going to do about it if that happens? Mm-hmm. And then a subset of that is Leon Panetta landed in India and talked to the Defense Department about now having Indian troops come in and train the police in Afghanistan, and now we'll have potentially India, Pakistan, via Afghanistan. And so if you could just see what you say about all of those three.
Yeah, people wonder why our relations with Pakistan are so bad.
We're not answering that. It's too depressing. Forget it, Wayne. Okay. Mark.
I mean, Afghanistan, I mean, if you were to say 3, 4, 5 years ago that the United States would be leaving, drawing down and prepared to be effectively out of Afghanistan with an unpopular government in their security forces that still are far below the standard that we would want them to be, a police force that is still considered very corrupt, you would be, I think, pretty concerned and somewhat depressed about this whole endeavor, right? And I do think that that the the drawdown, and whatever the final date is now, 2014 is when effectively the war will be declared over. I mean, I think that there is still a very good chance it will involve, if there is a settlement, it will involve something with the Taliban or Taliban-like groups in the southern part of the country and eastern parts of the country. There will be different sort of spheres of influence in the country, where the Haqqani network continues to have sort of parts of eastern Afghanistan. They've always been very closely aligned with Al-Qaeda. The potential is there. It is unlikely to look like the pre-9/11 safe haven where you had the Taliban, Al-Qaeda operating with impunity, but there is still it's not going to look like the country maybe we all envisioned after 9/11 or some envisioned after 9/11. So add to that. And so what can the United States do? I think there will continue to be special operations troops. There will be drone strikes. The United States will reserve the right to continue operations as they might arise. And so if there's intelligence about various Al-Qaeda people, the United States will say, well, we're going to hit them with drones. The Indian influence is, it's even, complicates, it's even greater. I mean, the very reason that Pakistan will not let go of some of the groups that it has historically aligned itself with is because what they have always feared is actually happening, right? The United States is pulling out. India is having an even greater influence in the country. I mean, if you see things from the Pakistani perspective, I mean, a lot of times we look at it and we say, how can they still help the Taliban? How can they still have ties to the Haqqani network? If you see it from the Pakistani point of view, they say, this is our neighborhood. We're here a lot longer than you, and the Indians are trying to exert their influence in Afghanistan. Why would we not use our own proxies, or at least reserve the right to use them? So, I mean, that dynamic after 11 years of war hasn't changed, and I don't think it will.
No, I would agree almost completely with everything you've said. I think one of the biggest challenges is that Al-Qaeda, I would argue, is much stronger in Afghanistan than we believe it is, and that they will seek to use a different situation or dynamic in Afghanistan to rebuild its strength. I agree completely with Mark. We're not going to see the exact same template as the past, but I think whichever administration is in office in the next 4 years is going to have to focus more attention on Afghanistan than they perhaps wish or anticipated.
I agree. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah.
Rafael Fernandez de Castro. What about international alliance?
Who's a member of the Mexico Institute Board.
And also the Latin American
And the Latin America Board, yes. So far.
Thank you. International alliances. Just following up with Jeannie's question, I mean, in this time of fiscal crisis, I mean, has been President Obama good enough, effective enough in forging international alliances? Because it seems to me that this is part of the strength against Al-Qaeda and the international terrorism.
I mean, it depends on I mean, in some cases, yeah. I mean, you could look at the war in Libya and the which was effectively it was a NATO operation, but as these things are, they're primarily U.S. operations under a NATO banner. As someone remarked earlier, the appetite for intervention and for a really expansive foreign policy in a lot of these countries that are our natural allies is diminishing. They've got disastrous economic situations, and so really paying putting the time and money into bolstering NATO to be able, just to take one example, the U.S. finds that it's often having to go it alone. I mean, I covered the Defense Department for 5 years and would go to these meetings in Brussels in NATO with Rumsfeld and Gates, and it would just be the same story every time. It would be we really want to ask our partners to give more, and this was before the economic recession, right? So that's it's even worse now. I think on individual levels, though, when you talk about international alliances, I think that you'll see sort of more case-by-case bases of of trying to bolster the security forces of an individual country, the U.S. will be allowed into a place like Yemen, for instance, and a lot of the effort will be to bolster that to fight terrorism. I mean, that's partly what's been going on in Pakistan. Because the U.S. can't send the 101st Airborne into every country, nor would we want them to, a lot of the future will be, and Bruce mentioned it, is this sort of individual case-by-cases working with governments to take care of their own problems. But it still means the U.S. is in kind of a lead on that.
Looking at the clock, let me suggest that both Bruce and Mark might take a minute each to summarize anything that you think you really wanted to say, some brilliant part of your answer that you forgot. And then I want to call on Barbara Hall, who's in the corner over there, to remind us what we do next. So, Bruce.
Okay. Well, I'll be very quick, and I'll actually answer your question as well. I think, ironically, the U.S. was more unilateral at the beginning of the Cold War when we needed to be multilateral, and we're going to have to be now unilateral because we can't be more multilateral. I mean, when you look at the troop drawdowns of our closest ally, Britain, I mean, the British Army is going to shrink to something that will be very difficult to deploy overseas. Changing government of France, for example, I think has eliminated what was a hugely supportive government of international action, especially in Libya. I would say, just in summarizing or in concluding, and it's almost at the risk of stating the obvious, we've made tremendous progress in the war on terrorism. We've been extremely effective in weakening the Al-Qaeda core's strength and power, but I think we face at least two fundamental challenges in the next decade. Firstly, as Mark pointed out, and I think he's absolutely right, the threat is increasingly migrating from the center to the periphery, and we find that the groups on the Al-Qaeda periphery, and it's not just my opinion. I mean, last year, the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of the NCTC, the Director of the CIA all said that AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, presents as great or perhaps even a greater threat to U.S. and international security as the parent organization does. And as I said in my analogy that it took Al-Qaeda core 10 years to become threatening and it took AQAP less than a year, I think that's a trend, unfortunately, we're going to have to be very careful of and monitor in places like West Africa and North Africa, perhaps even the Levant and elsewhere. And then I think the second challenge we'll face is that as long as the core still has a sanctuary, it will pin its faith and hopes in the diminishment of U.S. interest in South Asia and our withdrawal from Afghanistan. Whether they can take advantage of that opportunistically to recreate themselves or reestablish themselves remain to be seen. But that's why I worry that they will focus in the future on Afghanistan, which means they'll continue to focus on Pakistan and to dig in their heels there unless something is done to dislodge them and really utterly defeat them.
Mark.
I was just thinking about the title of this of the session. It's the sort of terrorism in the post-Bin Laden world. I'm just thinking back to a little over a year ago, when it was Sunday night. I was sitting on my couch getting ready to go to bed and get a call that the president was going to speak. And why would the president speak on a Sunday night at 10:30 at night? It has to be something big. And we obviously learned that Osama bin Laden had been killed. I went into the office, worked through the night, and it felt very much, maybe it was sleep deprivation, but it felt very much like this is an ending of something. And it was, besides the ending of bin Laden. It was, but the more time has gone on over the last year, I think we've realized that it's not, that the death of bin Laden was a significant event, a significant achievement in this sort of longer war, but it's morphing in ways we don't still understand. If we were to hold this session in a year or two, we'd probably be talking about countries that haven't even been brought up right now. Right. I don't know if Nigeria has been mentioned once in the last hour. I mean, there's countries that, and so it's all happening very quickly. The dynamics are changing, and but maybe it's ending it on a depressing note. But I think we're all in for a lot more of this.
Well, that leads to two things I want to say before turning this over to Barbara. The first is my deathless prose of the last decade, which is that the terrorists won't check our party registration before they blow us up. And it is really important, and I say this to a bipartisan audience, that we think about these threats as threats to American interests, not Democratic Party interests, Republican Party interests. We're all in this together, and that is something that the Wilson Center really believes. Our programming, our scholarship, our efforts are nonpartisan, and I just suggest to all of you, even if you have some partisan affiliations at the moment, that the next president, whether it's President Obama or President Romney, will, I hope, should, I hope, see it this way. Well, this interminable campaign will end eventually. Some of us may require medicine, but it will get over with. Anyway, that was the spirit in which these two addressed the issues. And in Bruce Hoffman and Mark Mazzetti, we have exceptional people who work at the Wilson Center on these issues. And I want to thank them.